start with.
Madam President, we're ready whenever
What are
you are.
doing? What is he doing?
Do you have sons?
Yeah, what?
You have two.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's 9 a.m., and we're ready to start the meeting. Rosie, are we ready?
Yes, Madam President, we are.
Okay, so I'm going to call the May 9th, 2025 meeting of SDCERS Board of Administration to order. Rosie, do we have a quorum?
Yes, Madam President, we do have a quorum with the following members absent: Mr. Brett Bartolotta, Paul Kaufman, and Louis Nguyen.
Okay, thank you. So before we move on to the agenda, please let me take a moment to welcome Kent Morris. So today is his first business meeting serving on this board, and he was elected by SDCERS active member, and his strong investment and operations background will be greatly valued to the investment committee and here on the board. So welcome, Kent. I would also like to announce that Bobby Spoon will continue her service as the Business and Governance Committee Chair. So thank you, Bobby. And Cliff Sherrison will continue his service as our Investment Committee Chair. So thank you, Cliff. And Paul Lotz has volunteered to begin service on our Disability Committee Chair. So thank you, Paul. So I would like to thank all our committee chairs for their leadership and willingness shouldering the additional responsibilities and time commitment. And I would also like to thank and recognize Vice Chair Sherrison for stepping in and running for the March meeting when I was out for my recognition for Girl Scouts. So moving on to public comment. Rosie, do we have any public comments today?
No, Madam President, we're not expecting any public comment for today's meeting.
Okay. Thank you, Rosie. So moving on to Section 4 of the consent agenda, that includes service retirements, drop entries, drop retirements, training, and board agenda calendar. So before I call a motion for the approval of the consent agenda items, would any board member like to pull any of the consent agenda items? Okay, well, hearing no comments, can I please have a motion and a second? And we're ready to vote.
And Madam President, it was moved by Mr. Clifford Chilson, seconded by Christiana Gauga, and with all votes in, this motion passes 9-0.
Thank you, Rosie. So we have 3 action items on our business and operations agenda this morning, starting with our first action item, confirmation of board president. Greg, will you please introduce this action item?
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to see the board this morning. At our March meeting, the board elected Lisa Marie Harris as our president for another term. And one of her presidential duties is she needs to identify a vice president to serve with her in this leadership role. And she has selected Cliff Sherrison. And President Harris believes Cliff is very well qualified to serve as our vice president due to his service as our vice president last year, his service as the chair of the investment committee, his very deep and well-known professional experience, and also his leadership roles with various associations in our community with various organizations. He has a strong leadership skill set, which includes leading using SDCERS Core's values of customer service, accountability, professionalism, fiduciary integrity, and transparency. And so the board's confirmation of Cliff Sherrison as SDCERS Vice President will require a motion followed by a second and at least 7 affirmative votes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Would any board member like to make any comments? No? Cliff, would you like to make any comments?
Thank you. No.
Okay. So may I have a motion and a second from board members? Okay, great. We have a motion and a second.
It was moved by Louis Maggi, seconded by Michelle Bush, and with all votes in, the motion passes 9-0, Madam President.
Congratulations, Cliff.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I would like to express my appreciation to Cliff to continuing his leadership on the board and look forward to working as president and vice president in the coming year. Okay, great. So we'll move on to the business and operations agenda item, amending the overpayment and underpayment benefits policy. And so at the recommendation of the CEO, this action item and the next action item have been set for discussion time today. And if we're unable to complete this action item and next action item by 10 a.m., so we'll be monitoring the clock, this might take some time and deliberation, we will consider tabling any remaining action or discussion until a future meeting. With that understanding, Johnny, would you please introduce this action item?
Yes, thank you, and good morning, board members. Special welcome to Kent. Welcome to the board. Today, we will continue our discussion from the February retreat on amending the overpayment of benefits policy and the administrative appeals policy, hopefully making decisions, broad decisions that we can, staff can then take, redline the policy, bring back in July. Because these issues implicate the board's fiduciary duties, we've invited fiduciary counsel. Ashley Dunning from Nossaman here from Oakland, thank you for coming in. Please feel free to ask her any questions or me, and I've asked Ashley to chime in when she feels it's necessary. Okay, let's start. At the February 2025 retreat, the board considered ways to change its policy on correcting overpaid benefits. In light of Secure Act 2.0, new IRS guidelines, and its fiduciary duties. We spent a lot of time talking about that, and so we've narrowed it down to the decisions or the guidance the board has, and hopefully have some votes today. At the retreat, we noted that SDCERS must correct benefits prospectively. We really don't have any discretion to continue to pay benefits we know are wrong. We also noted that the Secure Act 2.0 really changed the landscape a bit. It changed it to that if a fiduciary has the latitude to decide not to recoup overpayments and still retain their tax qualified status, so long as the error is an inadvertent benefit overpayment, something we will define soon. Moving fast here. At the retreat, we also noted that Secure Act 2.0 provided new restrictions for ERISA-governed plans concerning collection of inadvertent benefit payments. I'll explain to you in just a little bit that ERISA government plans are generally corporate plans, not government plans, but something we look to for guidance and what the IRS is looking for in terms of corrections. Secure Act 2.0 also directed the IRS to issue new revenue procedures or updated correction guidelines for government plans by the end of 2024, which has not yet happened, but when they do happen, SDCERS will need to abide by those regulations to the extent it wants to continue its tax qualified status. That status allows, among other things, our members to contribute to their pensions pre-tax or tax-free. At the retreat, the board showed interest in adopting the new IRS restrictions on ERISA-governed plans' ability to collect inadvertent benefit payments. Again, these are corporate plans, but we show them to you because this is what the new landscape looks like. And so through a show of hands, the board wanted to see what these look like and explore them more deeply today. So what we're going to do is go through those 5 restrictions. We'll talk about them first, and then you'll have the ability to vote on them or any other motions or changes or limitations you want to have. Okay? I kind of want to talk about what we're correcting. We're not talking about correcting everything. We've already established that we have to correct prospectively when we're correcting benefits wrong. If you notice, we're not even talking about underpaid benefits. If SDCERS wrongly underpays a member, we will fix that, absolutely correct that benefit by paying the correct amount retroactively, including interest. We're just talking about a smaller group of corrections, really, that concerns overpaid benefits. Under Secure Act 2.0, we're talking about eligible inadvertent failures, and those are failures that occur despite the existence of established practices and procedures that catch those things. We're also not talking about egregious failures, which are really related to only benefiting highly compensated employees, something that's really not part of our plan. Yes, Cliff?
On the term egregious here,
Yeah.
what if we were to discover a situation like we had where we had a plan member who kept on saying, wait, there's something wrong, and for making this up now, years
Yeah.
it was disregarded or not addressed. No, I'm not an English major, but that could be seen as egregious.
Yes.
And so I'm curious if you can unpack for us what's it sort of in scope and out of scope for
Absolutely.
this exemption, please.
Thank you for the question. The term egregious is defined under the IRS codes to really talk about a plan that has consistently and improperly covered only highly compensated employees, a plan that provides more favorable benefits to an owner of employer-based plans, etc. It's not really talking about the situation that you're discussing where we think it's terrible. It's a defined term. Do you have anything to add to that?
I think there's also an aspect here to who is conducting themselves egregiously, and as to what, and the context that I think you've described. Trustee Shearson is a member who is saying, administrator, I think something's wrong, and the retirement system isn't really addressing it. I don't think that's what the IRS is talking about.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. It's a powerful word, egregious, so.
It is, and as with a lot of terms used in the law, you have to unpack them in order to know exactly what they mean. But it's good that your counsel has identified some of the examples the IRS has given of what is considered egregious to them. And that's really misconduct by the administrator of favoring some over others in a way that appears to be almost purposeful, if you will, as opposed to simply not addressing something that should have been addressed earlier.
Kind of more of a human error.
An oversight, right?
Thank you.
And thank you for the question. Thank you for the clarification. To continue that, we're also not talking about correcting errors related to diversion or misuse of plan assets or abusive tax avoidance transactions. I like to think of it as your run-of-the-mill SDCERS plan sponsor calculate their benefit improperly because of fat finger or misinformation.
Or we've had situations, if I remember, where people have moved from one plan to another and maybe back, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
confusion, let's call it. So, yeah.
Yes, that human error. We're also not talking about failures that the IRS identifies through an audit before we do, or situations where SDCERS staff knew about an error and waited really too long to correct that error. Okay, so let's talk about what are these 5 ERISA governed plan corrections. Here they are. I'll talk about them more in detail, and then I wanted to give you an overview so that way you have a landscape of what we're talking about, and then we'll vote on them if you just want to at the end of this presentation.
Johnny, can I ask you a quick question on the slide before? What if there is no established practice or procedure related to the issue? Does that exclude it as well? If we didn't have a policy in place that spoke to that, a specific incident, would that be excluded?
I suppose it would. I don't think we would run into that situation, though. We have very detailed guidelines on
I
how
thought
we
that-
pay
yeah,
benefits,
yeah,
how we
one of the
calculate
issues
them.
that we dealt with, and I can't remember the specifics, I think it was related to a policy issue that, and maybe I'm wrong, but I just thought that there was some clarity that needed to be made in a policy related to an overpayment that created some of the confusion that we were dealing with as the board. It's the gentleman that we.
Yeah. Well, I think we would. There are, as you are learning, lots of different ways that an error can happen. And generally what we will do is we'll look at the error, we'll identify it. We often work with tax counsel on the appropriate way to fix that. So I think if tax counsel were to say this is not eligible for self-correction, then we would address it appropriately. Thank you for the question. Okay, I want to make clear that what we're talking about today is errors caused by the plan sponsor or the administrator. We're not talking about limiting collections caused by fraud, caused by the payee or because of the payee's death. We're also not talking about overpayments that violate IRS law, such as amounts that exceed payable under the different codes and regulations, or payments to disqualified persons. Okay? All right, let's get into the first one. The first ERISA plan restriction is no interest or other amounts may be sought on overpaid amounts for any period. So a corporate plan governed by ERISA under SECURE 2.0 can no longer collect associated interest with an overpayment. What's traditionally happens is a plan overpays a member, let's say $1,000, and that $1,000 is no longer part of the system, and they cannot invest that money, and there's an associated loss with that. That interest would be passed on to the overpaid retiree. What's this mean for SDCERS? Well, the city already, through an MOU with its recognized unions, decided to pay for associated interest to retirees. So as a practical matter, if the board were to adopt this, we're really talking about interest on overpayments to port and airport employees. How much is that? Staff doesn't track the historical interest associated with correction of benefits as detailed as this restriction comes up. But what we can tell you is that on average for the last 10 years, we've had about $165,000 in overpaid benefits each year. That includes the city employees. So if we look at the port and airport being less than 10% of our population, we're looking at estimate about 10% of that. And then if we're just talking about interest and not just principal, we're talking about even less than that. So I hope that gives you a scope of what adopting this restriction would cause.
And Johnny, you and I had a discussion about this, and part of that 165,000 is overpayments based on untimely death notifications and so forth.
Yes.
And it seems to me that my estimate would be that about half of what this 165, this is my opinion, would be the stuff we're talking about here, which is possible overpayment, not because a member or beneficiary died and we were not noticed. And in the background for this meeting, I mean, there are several of those examples with some significant money of people that we weren't noticed about their deaths.
Yes, that 165,000 is total overpaid benefit, so including death and other overpayments that we are excluding from today's discussion on correction of benefits. So even less than that amount.
So just to help my colleagues, because I found this helpful, you take $165,000, you take 10% of that, because that would be the port and the airport portion, and you assume 5% interest, just to pick an easy number. Could be different, could be lower, could be more. That works out to $825 a year.
Okay.
And I think it's 50% of that based on what I was saying before.
Okay, so at least we have, rather than saying a small number, we can make it a bit more tangible
Yeah.
for everybody, as an estimate only.
Thank you. I picked law because that numbers scare me, but thank you, Cliff. I appreciate yours.
Friends, Johnny.
Thank you. Yes,
I'm
Christina.
wondering if the city pays for that interest because of MOUs that they have with the REOs. Does it make sense to talk to, how would it work then for the port or the airport? Does it make sense to approach them and say, as part of this discussion, say, the city of San Diego, another plan sponsor has this. Are you interested in doing that for your members, or is that off the table?
Christiana, that is an excellent governance question, and one that Greg and I had discussed earlier. Is what we wanted to do is see where the board wanted to go. Recognizing that today the board has discretion, exercising its fiduciary duties and authority to administer the plan the way they see fit. And part of that is, how do we deal with overpayment of benefits? So if the board were to decide today that we are interested in not collecting interest from overpayments from the port and airport, I think we would take that recommendation and talk to the port and airport as a conversation, but not really as an ask, because that is our authority. Of course, the port and airport control the plan, kind of like the legislature does. So if they want to change their plan, I think they could. They could say that SDCERS shall collect interest, and that's one way they could address that. or they could continue to trust us in how we administer their plan and faithfully follow their plan design.
Thank you.
Thoughts?
No, I agree with that. That's exactly right.
That's my favorite answer. Does that answer your question, Christiana? Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. So this is what your vote will look like. I guess you would either adopt the restriction or you would just not make an action and we would continue the practice of collecting interest, or a board member would make a different vote. Let's talk about the second restriction for ERISA governed plans, which is the system seeks to recoup through an annuity offset. The payment cannot be reduced below 90% of the amount otherwise payable, and the amount recouped each calendar year cannot exceed 10% of the overpayment. So traditionally, most of in this situation, we're paying retirees. We figure out that they were overpaid a certain amount, and they can recoup that through their future benefit. So let's say they received $1,000 a month, and they owe a certain amount of money, we recoup a certain percentage of that. So they receive, let's say, $900 a month and recoup that $100 each paycheck until that overpayment is made. This restriction limits that annuity offset by the amounts described above.
So Johnny,
Yes.
as an example of what could happen under these circumstances, if I'm understanding this correctly, let's say somebody has a benefit that is the equivalent of $50,000 a year. And we go to them and we say, look, we made a mistake, and your benefit going forward is not $50,000 a year, it's $45,000 a year. Now we've knocked back $5,000 of income per year, and then in addition to that, under this scenario, we could take basically 10% a year off of that $45,000 even further until this were paid off.
That's correct.
That's
significant. Okay, thank you.
With the additional limit of no more than 10% of the overpayment. So if the overpayment was, in your example, had gone on for 3 years, 15,000, so it would be no more than 10% of that each year. So that's an additional limitation under this ERISA rule.
Yeah, and I understand. I'm just trying to point out that not only are they suddenly told that for the rest of your life, your benefit is going to be, in my example, $5,000 less, but in addition to that, until that's paid off, they're going to get even less than that amount.
Yeah, I mean, the point is the person earned a benefit. The benefit that they earned in your example is $45,000 a year. They've been overpaid by the system for a certain number of years, so they've gotten an additional $5,000 every year that they shouldn't have gotten. Yes, they've come to potentially anticipate that they would receive it every year, so there's that component to it. But SDCERS as a fiduciary needs to pay the $45,000 and no more. The question presented here is what to do about the amount that's already out the door that they've received, probably spent, maybe, and how you deal with that.
No, and I get that, Ashley, but in a way, my greatest concern is you are a working employee. You are trying to decide when it's appropriate for you to retire, like everybody does. You've got a budget. You go in to the retirement system and say, okay, well, what will I get for the rest of my life? And the retirement system says X, and you decide based on that, okay, I can stretch that. And then, sure, you were overpaid, but that's small consolation for the fact that for the rest of your life, you're going to get less money than was anticipated.
It seems to me as though that sort of analysis is probably the genesis for some of these restrictions.
Right. So yeah. So anyway, it's just a
ERISA.
philosophical comment. That's all.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you, Johnny.
As helpful as Chris's example is, does anyone have any context of what might be, if anything is typical of what these kinds of overpayments might mean? If somebody's getting a $50,000 payment, is the overpayment $5,000? Is it $500? I think it makes a difference perhaps if we could get some appreciation of what's the experience been along this dimension.
And I'd like to also understand what's the current practice.
The current practice, currently, we do not have a restriction on the amount we offset. I know I recall, there is a restriction that we must set the recoupment within the expected lifetime of the member. But other than that, I do not know of any
Okay.
restriction that we have on how much we recoup.
So if I can jump in, and please,
Please.
Sandra, correct me if I get this wrong, but right now we collect interest. So if we do find an error, and we've discussed it with the employee or the retiree, and we need to recoup it, we say, well, would you like to pay it off all now, interest-free, or would you like, we don't use this term, but would you like to finance it? And so we give them the choice. And as Johnny correctly pointed out, depending on how the age of the retiree, how long do you give them to pay it off? So if we adopt number one, that will probably change behaviors, because if it's interest-free, I can see people saying, I like rule number two. I would really like to stretch this out as long as practically possible.
But what about my question of, is it a 10 or 11% overpayment, or is it 1% or something else? Give us a sense, because it's rather stunning if all of a sudden your pension payment goes down by 10%.
Yeah.
Is that typical?
That I don't have the metrics on, I apologize.
Okay.
Yeah, Cliff, I do not know the average or the median overpayment.
Yeah, I mean, I can just tell you anecdotally,
That'd be helpful,
just
sure.
looking at these, there aren't that many of them, and they're small. Sometimes it's a few dollars. I don't think I've seen one that is a 10% decrease or, probably even a 5% decrease. These are small corrections.
Right, because it's sort of in the gears of a
Yes,
minor
yes.
miscalculation. And so it could be, less than $1,000 making a stab in the dark.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
On down to just a few dollars.
thank you very much.
I can't hit buttons this morning. So this says payments cannot be reduced. So does that take away that choice then? But I'm just
Yes.
Okay. So then even if let's say I was being overpaid, and I was like, oh, I think I'm being overpaid, I'm going to put this money aside, and some SDCERS comes to me and says, hey, we've been overpaying you, and here's your lump sum back. But if we agree to do this, that option no longer exists for me.
I think the member could pay it off in
Okay.
lump sum if they wanted to. I think the restriction is if we decide to recoup it through an offset, then that
Okay.
would be our limitation. Is that how you understand
Yeah, I
it?
agree with
Thank
that.
you.
Okay. Thank you.
I guess what I'm hearing from Greg is you're doing it right now. What this is really doing is putting some requirements, some limitations on what we can actually do.
Yes.
From kind of my understanding is that there are some organizations that mandate it. They don't give the choice. What they say is, we're going to take all the money. If we overpaid you, we're just going to stop paying you until we've recouped the money that we've overpaid you. So really what they're trying to do here is put some parameters on that so that somebody can't just be very heavy-handed and take all the money until the overpayment's satisfied.
That's the temperature.
Thank you. 2 quick points on this. If the board were to adopt this, staff does not believe this will really result in collecting less. We still think that we will collect the overpayment under this restriction. And I know, Christiana, you asked about benchmarking, kind of helping what do other systems do. If you recall at the retreat, we took a sample of California retirement systems and I examined all of their many policies. And I did not see a similar limitation on California public retirement systems concerning this restriction. Okay. This would be your vote. Either adopt the change, continue the ability to collect annuity offsets without a restriction, or take another action.
As we go through all 5 action items, is there a recommendation by you?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm going to say that for the end. Right. Number 3, efforts to recoup may not include threats of litigation or collections unless doing so would result reasonably in recoupment. Currently, staff does work with a collection agency, and we do write in our letters that this could lead to litigation. I definitely wouldn't consider it a threat. If you look at our collection numbers, they're, I think, kind of poor. $6,000 over 5 years isn't very threatening. We have one lawsuit that we collected $40,000 in the last 15 years that I've been at this desk. So there isn't a lot of litigation. There isn't a lot of collection efforts, but we do use them. Let's see here. Any questions about this?
I have one quick question. What is our outstanding payable amount now for overpayments?
Outstanding payable, like how much is due to us?
Yeah, how much, yeah.
It's a good question. I don't know that answer. Do we have any idea?
Not without adding up the spreadsheet that
Yeah.
we have.
I'm sorry, I do not know that answer. I can get it for you.
Just curious.
Yes.
The magnitude, materiality of what is owed to us.
Well, on average, it's less than $165,000 a
Yep.
year.
Okay. A year.
A year, on average. Yes.
I had a question. Could you please help me understand the parentheses? So,
Yeah.
so
That's a good one. It seems to swallow up the rule, right? Chris asked me, as a practical matter, what does this mean if you were to adopt this rule? And I think as a practical matter, what we do is we find an overpayment, and my team will look to see if there's any viable source. So we'll look at, is there a probate? Is there an estate? Is there a bank account that's still open with assets? If that's the case, I think then it's reasonable that these efforts to collect, it's reasonable to do that. If we find nothing, there's just nothing out there and that happens, then I think the direction staff would not be to threaten litigation or collections. Yeah, just good question. So in the example, the last bullet point there, we were in touch with the overpaid person. They had money. They still had it. And so I think it was reasonable to threaten litigation because that person said, I wasn't going to pay it unless you sue me. Okay. And this is what your vote would look like. The fourth restriction, recoupment cannot be sought from a beneficiary. This ERISA governed rule is already part of the correction guidelines for government entities, such that if we overpaid a retiree and the retiree had a surviving spouse continuance benefit, a different benefit, the law does not provide or allow us to recoup that money from that beneficiary stream, because it really isn't the retiree's money. That's the new beneficiary's money. So adopting this process wouldn't really change how we do stuff, but it would bring this to the forefront of what we're doing as a policy decision. So if the correction guidelines were to change, we would still have that as a policy.
Johnny, on that one, can recoupment be sought by from the estate of a beneficiary?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. The last ERISA governed restriction, recoupment may not be sought if first overpayment occurred more than 3 years prior. The example would be we overpaid a member for 1 or 2 years, 3 years, we would recoup that overpayment. If we overpaid them for 4 or 5, 10 years, we would recoup nothing. We think that adopting this practice may result in collecting less overpaid benefits. It's hard to calculate how much that is because we do not track correction of benefits based on date of discovery, length of the correction. But again, you've got those numbers up there of, on average, we identify $165,000 in overpayments. So adopting this policy would probably end up collecting less than that amount.
So, Johnny, this is one of the more extraordinary pieces of this that it's hard to really wrap your head around. But the way I read this, if we were to have overpaid somebody $5,000 a year for 4 years, so $20,000, we wouldn't be able to recoup any of it. If we overpaid somebody $5,000 a year for 2 years, we could recoup $10,000 from them. I do not understand the logic of this. To me, some variation on this would be much more logical in my mind. Let's put it that way.
Sure, thank you, Chris. To help benchmark this, what do other California systems do? In the sample that I studied earlier this year, I did not find any California system that had adopted this ERISA governed policy. Something similar to it would be maybe the 3-year look back that we can find in CalPERS, CalSTRS, LACERA's retirement plan system, where they say under that policy, if we overpaid a member 4 years, we would only collect the last 3 years. Okay.
Which is option C.
In a quick comment, does it seem like most of the time you collect the majority of the money owed within the first 3 years? Is it minimal, like the interest? That would, because it is important at some point, I think, just to move forward and cut your losses, depending on the energy it takes to pursue it.
The large majority of our overpayments are caught within a year, let alone 3 years. Okay? Mm-hmm. And that's what our vote would look like. Well, with that, it's time to vote if we want to.
So before we vote, if I could throw out a little conversation about option C and D?
Sure. C and D.
The take other action?
Oh, yes. Let me bring back that slide. This one?
Not any one in specific. It's just all of the options ended in take other action. So
okay.
My thought is this. All of these restrictions have come about basically as an acknowledgement that members are being hurt with these lookbacks. When we or our plan sponsors find an error, going forward, of course, they have to be paid the correct amount. But these lookbacks, as Chris's example illustrated, can do some real harm to folks. And my thought is we should probably go further than just the interest. And I go back to the very beginning of the presentation. I think it's slide number 3, where it says that plans have the latitude to decide not to recoup overpayments. And as we've also heard, the amounts we're talking about are minimal to the plan. $165,000 for the city, plus interest, and that's including the overpayments due to untimely death notifications, which wouldn't even fall under this. So a very small amount to us, a very big amount to our retirees. If we have the latitude to not recoup those overpayments, that would be my suggestion. If it's our fault, and notwithstanding all of the restrictions you outlined, I think it was on slide 9, if it's our fault, we waive it. That's my suggestion.
But I don't think we can waive.
That's what slide 3 says.
You're talking about waiving all overpayments.
Looking back, not prospectively.
Yeah. Thank you. And that goes, I think, to the heart of the hours of discussion we had at our February retreat is what is our duty? And it's a duty to the membership as a whole. So even though this overpayment will definitely affect an individual, how does that reflect on our duty to pay the correct benefits, to keep the trust fund whole, and to ideally get to full funding and make sure we pay the benefits for everyone else as well? Did you want to add anything?
So,
No, go ahead. I could speak now, or I could wait for your comment.
okay. So I would suggest that a discussion of what Lou's talking about would be valuable, because if we go in that direction, then we don't have to worry about any of the rest of these things, and we'll be done before 10 o'clock, which would be nice. But I would also suggest this, that we are essentially doing a job on behalf of the plan sponsors, and they expect us to do a good job. I think the plan sponsors by using us to accomplish these goals, understand that we are fallible. We're not perfect. And that part of our work as the retirement board includes the reality that we're going to make some small mistakes from time to time. And the sponsor knows that they're going to have to pay for some of those mistakes. That's just a reality of how it goes. We don't have to worry about what's going to happen to the trust fund. From my perspective, we're talking about a $12 billion trust fund, and this is, from my perspective, budget dust when it comes right down to it. But it sure isn't for the members, the individual members. And what concerns me the most is the idea of this people making lifetime decisions based on the information that we give them. They're already going to be harmed as a result of the adjustment. We can't do anything about that. They're going to be harmed for the rest of their lives because of the mistake. What we can do is not add insult to injury by making them pay that back amount. So I think we should discuss what Lou's talking about, and I certainly favor that. And if a majority are in favor, then we resolve the rest of these issues.
Well, I'd like to hear what Johnny's recommendations are.
I know that, Greg.
I just wanted to mention that there's been a lot of discussion today about the materiality, and I really appreciate Cliff raising these questions at the board retreat and us trying to quantify that. But one of the things we talked about is part of our March meeting, and we were looking at the action plan and getting this organization ready for potentially using big data and artificial intelligence, is actually going through our databases and going, how clean is that data? How well have we administered this plan in the past? And so there is the potential for something material to be fixed. You may recall in my mid-meeting CEO update, I talked about a potential issue with regards to one of our plan sponsors and something that happened back in the early 2000s that we're still trying to understand what is the magnitude of that and meet with the plan sponsor about that. And it may be a problem, it may not be, but that has a potential of being very material. So again, I just really want to just put that out in the open, is that while on average things are generally not material, it does have the possibility to be very material. So as we go through these, and I think that's just important to say. Thank you.
You, Greg.
So on the fiduciary point here, all these decisions are restricted to inadvertent eligible failures. So it's a limited group. One should think about organizational risk potentially and governance issues if you basically say from here on out, we are not going to collect amounts that we've overpaid. Is that a context where you've sort of eliminated a check that promotes better, more timely review of accounts so that you motivate corrections quickly? Because then you could imagine that potentially fostering an odd incentive to not discover risks in a timely way. So that might be a reason not to adopt such a broad rule that you will not collect overpayments. That said, there is a lot of precedent in other plans in California where certain types of errors are discovered that apply very generally across the membership to decide in those contexts not to seek overpayments. So there certainly can be, or seek to recover overpayments. There can be a very strong fiduciary basis on which to make that determination on a, based on the facts presented as to a particular type of error that's needing to be corrected. And that may be the context that your CEO is talking about, or may not be. But you may want to reserve to yourself a little bit more discretion to address these things on a go-forward basis while potentially adopting some of these restrictions, which in my view, and I think your general counsel's as well, that are, some of them are, that have some merit. But not to go the full way of saying, we from now on, we're never going to collect an overpayment, because that, I think, could potentially breed some odd behavior.
So perhaps we take a look back, see where our overpayments have been, and list them out specifically, instead of saying all under overpayments. We just list specifically what we know. That way we're protecting ourselves for what we don't know in an AI scenario that finds something that we have no idea about.
Would that look like some kind of dollar threshold that did have some materiality consideration in it?
Possibly. I mean, I defer to your staff on exactly what parameters they'd propose. And I think that's already built into your policies, too.
Yeah. Thank you. Lisa Marie, you asked my opinion on the proposal. And overall, what staff liked about looking at these ERISA governed restrictions is that it mitigated, it helped the member a bit, but recognized our duty to collect the lion's share of the overpayment. And so it's a little give and take that way. And one, the government has passed legislation saying that this is appropriate, and leaning on that legislation, I think a reviewing court would find this board's actions reasonable in adopting that. I would think it's unprecedented in my experience for a retirement system to just not collect overpayments. So I think there's risk involved in that. When I started here at SDCERS, the system was embroiled in litigation over 2,000 members and $150 million worth of corrections. Not all of those were overpayments that we're looking at. But that's a substantial amount of money, I think, for the board to have a policy, sort of carte blanche policy that says we wouldn't collect some of that, maybe pushing the discretion of the board and not knowing what is in the future. So
That's a great example, if I might step in, where you have a plan term, that's the cost neutrality term relating to service credit purchases. And as you probably all know, or most of you know, there was a lot of litigation about that, where the court ultimately said you don't have the authority to put the cost of those service credit purchases on the employer in a cost-neutral context. So that may well be a circumstance where you have a lot more limited discretion, if any discretion at all, on the overpayment point. So again, suggesting maybe a handcuff of yourself in such a broad way might not be the most prudent next step, though you could do that maybe in some circumstances in the future, depending upon what the circumstances are.
Yeah, I'm fine with guardrails onto the types of overpayments we're talking about and to amounts. I just think as a general rule, a run-of-the-mill, miscalculation that's our fault, not the members, they shouldn't have to shoulder that. But I am, cognizant of the issues you bring up.
But I think it depends on the circumstances also, because what if it is this sort of radical example of a 10% error? That's different than if it's a $50 a month error, in my opinion. And I think we also have to think about how the pieces fit together of what we, in terms of our positions in overseeing the staff, of the kind of job that staff is doing in assuring that the quality of these calculations is at the highest level. It benefits everybody that, that there's no misunderstandings at the outset, and that people are given the best straightforward understanding of what is due to them, not more, not less, but what is due to them. And so part of what this discussion ought to include, I think, is an ongoing discussion of what staff is doing to try to minimize these errors. There will always be errors because we're human. I get it. But we also ought to hear not only about what are the errors, but all right, maybe twice a year or something like that of, okay, there's this little task force and this is what we've done to accomplish progress along this dimension. Everyone benefits from that, it seems to me. And we have to think about, I think, the plan sponsors and the employees who are paying into the plan, because it's $165,000 a year, and maybe we could have reduced that through other steps, and I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, just to make things better. And instead it's of $85,000, we cut it in half. How many potholes is that the city could fix each year? There's finite dollars floating around that go to run these important operations at the port, at the airport, and at the city. So I think there's a balance we need to think about. That may be a dollar threshold or something else. And it may be the type of error as well. I don't know.
Is an alternative to this, and looking at the seeming illogic of one of these options of, if it's more than 3 years, you recoup nothing, but if it's within 3 years, you recoup the full amount, is an option to say we're not going to recoup past 3 years or 2 years or something like that? And so we still recoup some funds, but if we don't discover it for 10 years, you owe the last 2 years or some, I'm just coming up with some sort of an alternative here.
That was one of the actions.
That's one of the options.
It's one of the options.
I didn't catch that.
We've anticipated your needs, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It
Well,
was-
this is not my preferred outcome, by the way.
I think the option that you're talking about would be C there, and what CalPERS, CalSTRS, and LSERS retirement systems, well, their legislation does, which is only collect the last 3 years of.
Would you go for 2?
There's also case law that supports that for some of the other systems, which is just based on the general government makes an error, statute of limitations, which is 3 years. And so that has a lot of grounding in California law that could support it.
Could you please remind me, if I think Board Member Brewster had brought up an example earlier about somebody who was supposed to retire with a benefit of $45,000 a year, and let's pretend we overpaid them $50,000 a year. If we move to recover, if we discover the error and we move to recover those funds, and let's say I'm that member, what appeal process do I have?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm out of time to talk about the appeals process, but there's a nice full appeals process. The member can challenge it. It goes to staff right now. Staff looks to make sure that the correction is proper under the overpayment policy and gives whatever relief the board has given the CEO authority to give, if any. If not, then the member staff would deny that appeal, and then they would appeal it to the Business and Governance Committee, for which this board would then hear that appeal.
So,
and then after that, if they wanted a review of the Superior Court, they could do that.
okay, that's really helpful. So we already have a process whereby if somebody's like, there was an error, I think it's unjust or unfair that I have to pay it, it would still come to the board, and we would, potentially, it could escalate up to, okay,
Yes, under the current policy.
thank you.
But Christiana, I would only say that, and you've pointed out this before, if they appeal and we grant somebody's appeal and not somebody else's, that's not a good thing either, right? I mean, it needs to be some sort of standard that we follow.
Yes, I agree with the standard. There would have to be a decision made on what and why. So maybe there's some clarification there. But I don't think, no, I would not be able to, I would not be able to support just kind of having a policy of if there's an error, we're just going to forgive. Even I think up to a certain amount, because
Even with the guardrails of types?
I would really want to see that. I wouldn't feel comfortable making that decision right now on the fly. I would want to really kind of understand that in greater depth. I would want to know how many cases that applies to. And even then, when you've tried to, in my mind, when you've tried to guard for certain things, there's always going to be things that you don't know that's inadvertently kind of taken up.
That's why it would be limited to what would be on the list that they create, as opposed to the broader thing that I suggested in the beginning.
I'd have to see it.
Well, Lisa Marie, I have 5 more minutes. I'd love some board direction if the board is interested in taking some. We have these 5 restrictions it can vote on. I know Lou Maggi and Chris had a conversation. I don't know if that's a vote that you're proposing, but where would you like to take it from here?
Well, from collectively just listening to the board of directors, I think it would be helpful to get, if we're going to take another action that's not listed, we need more data points. And I think it might be helpful to have more data points. And I know there was a question that Michelle asked that it might be helpful if you can come back and provide specific data to help us with this idea of threshold or criteria, so we can at least compare it to what these options are, so everyone is comfortable. So there's a possibility we can defer this to July and then have additional follow-up presentation with these extra data points. I was curious, what is the pleasure of this board?
I would support that.
Could I ask just one more clarifying question in terms of data points? I would also be interested to know if any of the changes being proposed would result in a fiscal change for staff, like there would be additional fiscal costs related to administration of any of these changes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
Or reductions.
Opposite of that is
Yeah.
what is the workload reduction in creating thresholds where these things, you don't have to spend as much time on them because we've created some thresholds that are not material that we're able to move past, yeah.
Johnny, that 3-year limit, who's using that, CalPERS or whatever?
Yeah, the state passed legislation for CalPERS plan, CalSTRS plan, and SDCERS plan.
So you still recover some funds, but
Yes.
if it was a real old case, then, okay.
And
Yes.
a lot of the county systems have a 3-year look-back limitation, too.
Okay.
Under 338 of the of the California Code of Civil Procedure.
That makes a heck of a lot more sense to me than this other ERISA thing of, wiping it out if it's over 3 years, but not if it's under or whatever. So, thank you.
Okay, then I have our direction. Thank you. I really appreciate your morning.
thank you. Thank you, Johnny.
We have 3 minutes, actually. Thank you.
Okay, we'll be moving to business governance operations action. No, we're disability. So we're not going to, the staff decision regarding benefits policy, we're not going to do, that was included in this?
We've tabled
Everything.
action items under business operations, action item A2 and A3 are tabled to a later meeting.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so that finishes business operations, and we'll be moving to Section 6, Disability Committee. So I'll announce our Disability Committee Chair, Paul Lotz, to please provide your Disability Committee report. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Lisa Marie. The Disability Committee met yesterday and unanimously approved both action items on today's Disability Committee's consent agenda. We will discuss consent items 1 and 2, and then the board will vote on these. Am I reading yesterday? Yeah, this is the right one. We'll vote on these items as one motion. Are there any action items the board members would like to pull for a separate vote? Am I on the right sheet? I am. Okay. Let me check my notes really quick. I may have grabbed the wrong one. So let's see. Okay. Starting with consent agenda items 1 and 2, approve the industrial disability retirement applications for Oscar Ramirez and Franklin White. These 2 applications for industrial disability retirement were approved by the committee, and as they are for the same type of benefit, the following applies to each application. The committee approved these members' application for industrial disability retirements, as each application was supported by evidence of being permanently disabled, being attributable to work duties and causing the need for leaving employment. Are there any questions from the board on consent items 1 and 2 before I move to approve the Disability Committee consent items 1 and 2? Okay, thank you, Cliff, for making that movement. I move approval of Disability Committee consent items 1 and 2. Please record your vote. Votes have been recorded. This finishes the Disability Committee action items. Staff provided a disability status report, and it is available in the board agenda package.
And Mr. Chair, if I just may, for the record, it was moved by Mr. Clifford Cheerson, and with all votes in, this motion passes 9-0, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The disability report provides an overview of the disability application review. Statistics highlighting the caseload is in good shape with a caseload of 18 applications, with all but one case within the 18-month processing window, which has been delayed due to the member's non-related health condition. Additionally, the committee provided direction to staff to bring back policy recommendations on the annual affidavit process, to consider not reaching out to disabled members whose injury is obviously not expected to improve, to the extent they will no longer be permanently incapacitated and not entitled to a disability benefit status. Are there any questions and comments from the board members or staff? Side comments only.
We were just discussing what a great job you're doing, Chair.
Hey, thank you. I'm
Doing a
watching.
great job, Paul.
Thank you. Back to you, Lisa.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Paul. And now we'll move to business and governance. So I'll announce that Business and Governance Chair Bobby Spoon, would you please provide your committee report?
Sure. The Business and Governance Committee met yesterday, and before I review the 5 action items and make a motion for the consent agenda approval of action items 1 through 5, are there any action items the board members would like pulled for a separate vote? No?
No, but could I make a comment before we vote? Well, thank you for that.
Yes.
Appreciate that. I just wanted to mention that an issue was brought forward by myself about annual affidavits that are sent to disabled members, people with disability retirements. And there was just a question of whether in some cases where the disability is so is one that someone would not be able to recover from, if we still need to send those affidavits out. And I gave an example of a police officer who'd been paralyzed as a result of shooting. And staff has agreed to go back and look at that to see if there's some way to come up with a kindler, gentler approach. Thank you.
That was good. Yes.
I do have a question about the COLA calculation. So is that just for SDCERS, or is that also adopted by the city of San Diego?
That is just SDCERS. It's in the municipal code on the broad parameters of the program, and then we have established a methodology to do that, and we hire Chiron as our expert to calculate the COLA every year, and they provide us a report, which is included in your board materials.
Okay. And so the COLA is 1.4.
2.9?
2.9.
Oh, okay, I'm looking at this. Okay. 2.9, okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
But Bobby needs to go through her.
Oh, I know, I'm just asking.
All right. Staff's recommendation to approve Shira Cohen as an independent non-board member on the audit committee. SDCERS uses an audit committee which includes up to 4 members from our community that are independent of the SDCERS board and our plan sponsors. With 3 of our independent non-board members on the audit committee serving their final term, we have the opportunity to bring in a very well-qualified candidate to serve on the audit committee. The committee unanimously approved recommending to the board to appoint Shira Cohen. Shira is a PhD. She's a professor at San Diego State. She's an accounting professor, and she's just overwhelmingly very well qualified. She's just attained her tenure at the school, and she's looking to volunteer in the community, and she heard of the opening and applied for it. So I've met with her, had lunch with her. We would be so fortunate to have her on the audit committee, and she is a delight. She's a delightful person. And she's written a couple of papers on pension funds.
Oh, wow.
Her list of publications is about 4 pages long. It's amazing, but a few of them are on pension funds. So she'll be a wonderful addition to the committee. Are there any questions or comments regarding this item? Okay, moving to consent agenda item number 2, staff's recommendation to approve the annual cost of living adjustment, COLA, effective July 1st. Sandra reported that the Consumer Price Index changed 2.9% and resulted in the plan paying the maximum COLA of 2%. The committee voted unanimously to recommend approval of the annual cost of living adjustment. Interestingly, Chris shared that over the past 25 years, the 2% COLA program has successfully protected our retirees from the nearly 80% of the inflation damage cumulatively over this time. Although most pension plans in California have a 2% COLA program, many state plans do not have a COLA program or offer lower inflation protection. SDCERS retirees are very fortunate to have this benefit offered by the plan sponsors. The committee unanimously approved this item. Are there any questions or comments regarding this item? And thank you, Chris, for your contribution to that. Moving to consent agenda item number 3, staff's recommendation to hire Agria Solutions as our Microsoft 365 integration consultant. Michelle Wagner-Malecki presented staff's recommendation to enter into an agreement with Agria Solutions as our Microsoft 365 consultant. This aligns with the approach laid out in the IT strategic plan and is the first phase of a multi-year effort to migrate SDCERS into Microsoft 365. Through a competitive bidding process, SDCERS received 6 proposals for this project. The evaluation team narrowed the selection down to 2 consulting firms that presented their solutions. Agria Solutions showed a strong understanding of our scope of services and a very knowledgeable project team. Agria Solutions is a Microsoft partner and have wonderful references from other municipal agencies that worked with them on similar projects. The committee unanimously approved recommending we hire Agria. Are there any questions or comments regarding this item? Staff's recommendation to purchase cyber liability insurance. Johnny and Thomas Joyce from Alliant Insurance Brokers gave a presentation on SDCERS cyber insurance. The committee unanimously approved the cyber insurance coverage. Are there any questions or comments on this item? Nope. And number 5, staff's recommendation to amend the Chief Compliance Officer Charter, the confidentiality of member information policy, contracting policy and delegation of authority to execute contracts and other documents, insider and personal trading policy, Division 7 of the board rules, disability applications and hearings, and Division 8 of the board rules, annual affidavits, medical reexaminations, and hearings. Johnny presented staff's recommended changes to these governance documents, including additional changes to Division 8, which were provided to our board earlier this week. The committee approved these amendments unanimously. And those additions were brought forward by Chris. And Chris, I want to thank you for taking the time to do that. And they were very good additions. Are there any questions on these?
I do have a question on the addition for the term of contracts. So in the red line version, it says the board may delegate to the CEO the exercising of contract extensions for terms 5 years or less. So I'm just curious, because we did have an issue with our Aon contract yesterday. By delegating in that authority to the CEO, do we then not have the opportunity to weigh in on that decision if we delegate it to the E CEO?
So thank you for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
So Right now, our policy is silent about contract extensions if it's not discussed when we enter into the contract. So there's no direction or expectations on staff's behaviors with regards to these contract extensions. So one solution would be that in our policy, generally we like to limit the contracts, the very large, significant contracts, to no more than 5 years. And if those contracts have a negotiated extension to it that are beyond 5 years, the board reserves the right to consider, should we extend that contract, yes or no? And generally, those are high-dollar, significant relationships for this organization. We also have quite a few shorter-term contracts, which are generally around 3 years. Once in a while, they will have a 1 year or 2 1-year extensions. And if those are less than 5 years, it's proposed to delegate that to staff to exercise those contract extensions if staff, in their judgment, find that it's favorable to the organization. Potentially, the contracts have a lower negotiated price than the current market, or if business conditions warrant that we want to extend that relationship while we go to RFP or seek another vendor.
So I guess my question is, using the example yesterday, if we were to vote for this, then potentially that option would not have come back to the investment committee.
It would have. That was
would
a 5-year contract with
Okay.
our general investment consultant, and there were 2 1-year additional contract extensions, and that would have come back to the board for their consideration.
Okay, because what's confusing me, it says for contract terms 5 years or less. So maybe it should say 3 years or less? Because you would need, if it's going to be a 5-year with 2 1-year extensions, that would apply to the first part of the red line. So why do you need the second line, the second addition, to have 5 years? It's just confusing me.
It should be less than 5 years for staff and 5 years or more for the board. So I apologize if that did not get wordsmithed appropriately.
And the amount, when you say less than 5 years staff, more than 5 years board,
But
there's no dollar threshold for the contract that's also part of that decision?
In the contracting policy, there are dollar amounts. So if it is $50,000 or less, that falls within the CEO's authority. If it's $100,000 or more, well, there's 50 to 100 and then over 100. So there's already a stratification of who has the authority to sign contracts.
So I think the language also was confusing to me of the extension is 5 years or less, or the original term of the contract is 5 years or less.
It would be the original term of the contract.
Doesn't say that.
Okay.
Might need to take another
But
look at
I think,
We'll take another swing at this one and bring it
Yeah, I
back.
think maybe just take out the second part.
well, I think that might be an important distinction. So sometimes the way I read it is if staff are like, well, we're going to do this 3-year contract with 2 1-year options. Now that falls under the threshold, and staff are like, yep, it's been a great 3 years. It turns out we do need them for another 1 year. Maybe it's an as-needed contract. We're going to administratively do it. If the dollar amount for the whole 3 plus 2 1-year options is over certain thresholds, my understanding is it would come to the board at that. So we would have approved that 3 with the potential 1-year options. Am I reading that part correctly? Like, is that, okay.
Yeah.
I guess the part I don't understand is when the original contract comes to the board, we approve the original term plus the extension at that time.
One of the challenges that we had with the general investment consultant is that at the time we approved the contract, I don't think the extensions had been negotiated. And so that wasn't part of the conversation with the board at the time. And there was no direction.
When you said they were not negotiated, you mean in the original contract? I don't understand what
So
that means.
Generally, when we have a relationship that comes to the board, there may not be a finalized contract in place when the board votes to move forward with that relationship. And so we have a proposal that says, this is the scope of work, this is the dollar amount, But then you get into the contract negotiations of all the legal issues, and then staff actually did a good job in that they actually negotiated some favorable contract extensions. But it was never discussed by the board or the committee at that time.
So the final deal never comes back to the board for you to say, hey, we ended up signing a contract with these terms, that the final contract, post-negotiation?
Generally not.
I don't.
Well, I would recommend that this issue be rewritten a little bit and come back.
Okay, yeah, we'll bring it back at our next meeting. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
I guess we're voting on all of them except that one.
Yep.
You're fine.
So I move to approve items 1 through 4.
It would be 1 through 5?
Now we need to change it, I guess.
But we can,
So
And bring
we
5
can say
back.
we can approve 1 through 5 with the understanding staff will bring back the contract policy at the July meeting.
Yeah, this one right here, Bobby.
so then we can
This
vote
one.
on all those other policies. They're
This
fine.
one is gonna,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So we'd just
Yeah,
be pulling the contract policy.
that's fine.
okay, perfect.
So there's a bunch of policies
In
there.
5,
And so
Yeah.
we would just be pulling one of
We're
them.
pulling the contract policy.
yeah.
We're going to revisit this next time.
So I moved. Oh, Christina moved.
Mr. Brewster, would you like to cast your vote?
Oh, sorry.
And with all votes in, Madam Chair, this motion passes 9-0.
Thank you, Rosie. Moving on, we had one information item, and it was presented by Johnny, and it's called the Life Verification Project. Johnny informed the committee of a new pilot project to perform life verifications on older retiree beneficiaries residing in locations where state-provided death reports are inadequate. The goal is to avoid late death notifications and minimize the loss to SDCERS and the stress to families with our collection efforts. This issue is primarily in states that don't report deaths. So there have been circumstances where deaths have not been reported and the benefits continue for years into the future. So Johnny is leading a verification project internally to follow up on a certain group of beneficiaries that are receiving benefits ages 75 and over. How many are there?
It's a small population. We estimate about 100 out-of-state
Yeah.
non-members, sort of survivor continuances that are 75 and older.
And staff will call, telephone, will contact, or they will reach out to all of those 100 to verify
Oh, Chris.
the status.
Cliff has a
I'm just
question.
curious, this is intriguing, given what we were talking about earlier this morning. Can you give us an example of 1 or 2 states where this is particularly acute in our own experience?
Sure.
And also whether there's any joint venture thinking of other plans? Because if we have this issue, undoubtedly there are other counties, cities, or state level plans that similarly may have members who retire to other jurisdictions?
Yeah, thank you, Cliff. It's a problem industry-wide. In my conversation yesterday, it's estimated that U.S. pension plans overall overpay about $1 billion in overpayments because they weren't notified of a person's death. The problem started when the Social Security Administration started limiting access to their death member file. Before, pension plans used to get 95% of the information now. Now it's estimated, because they keep cutting that information back, we get about 16% from that, which has caused retirement systems like us and every other system I know to hire companies that look at public information and try to gather information on deaths. This problem is compounded by privacy laws that increase in different states. And so you'll hear what Bobby said, some states don't report privacy deaths. So an example that you asked, in Oregon, for some reason there wasn't any reporting, and we just found out of a death that happened 4 years ago. So we have a lot of different mechanisms, and I think we're pulling all the levers, and this is a small one we want to try to reach out to a problem area that Sandra was kind enough to help us identify, and hopefully this is we have good results with it.
Arizona's another state.
Yeah.
And
Well,
we
I
have
think a lot of people would move from
A lot of
here.
retirees in
Yeah.
Arizona.
And Cliff, I think just context in our backup material, there's one continuance payee of $55,000. I mean, it's, yeah.
It seems to me that this is an industry-wide issue. You have all these plan sponsors that indirectly are bearing the cost of this, that there ought to be some recognition of balancing the various needs for privacy which are coming to the fore in many different contexts with the economic reality that monies are going out on, that shouldn't go out, So anyway, enough said.
Are there services, Johnny, that do that?
Yes, we work with 2 companies right now to help identify deaths.
Okay.
And so we've really ramped up this program in the last few years.
All right, so other than that, we heard reports from Member Services, Benefits Administration, and IT. All of those were presented to the committee. And in our packet was the Legal Division report, Finance, the financial statements, and the listing of members owing in excess of $10,000. And that's it. Back to you, Lisa.
Awesome. So thank you, Bobby, for that committee report. We'll now move to Section 8, the Investment Committee. So Investment Committee Chair Cliff Sherrifson, would you please provide us your committee report?
Thank you very much, Lisa Marie. The Investment Committee met yesterday afternoon and covered 3 action items and 1 information item. The 3 action items are on the consent agenda. Action item number 2, the 2025 Asset Liability Study recommendation, is being pulled for a separate discussion and vote today. Before I review the remaining 2 action items and make a motion for the consent agenda approval, would any board members like either of these items pulled for discussion and a separate vote?
Yeah, I want to pull the number 3. I'd like to see us go out to bid in the second year in recognition of the favorable terms negotiated by staff for the Aon contract.
Okay, well,
So change it from 1 year to 2 year?
Right.
so we're going to vote on number 1, the consent agenda, and then come back
Perfect.
to these other 2 items. Okay. So starting with consent agenda item number 1, that is a selection of a private markets consultant. And for that, Corinna, do you want to say something about our discussion yesterday, which I think it's fair to say was quite fulsome?
Yes, indeed. A bit of background for everyone. The investment committee looked to hire a private market consultant to oversee certain asset classes that didn't have consultant coverage. As a reminder, Makita is our consultant on real estate, and SDCERS does invest more directly in that area. In the other areas, we have coverage from 2 private market advisors, Stepstone and GCM. So the investment committee set up a subcommittee consisting of Cliff, Lisa Maria, and Michelle, and certainly want to thank them for their service in helping the staff to craft not only the scope of work, but also the full RFP. So we sent out an RFP. We also posted it on the website, and we received a number of responses. And after going through thorough due diligence process, Callan and Makita were selected as finalists, and they presented to the investment committee. Both firms have strong resources. They both provided very solid proposals. They had an in-depth understanding of our needs. And ultimately, the committee did favor Callan's proposal. Callan also offered more of a flat fee proposal. And I think that was advantageous for the board. So that's a brief summary. If you want me to go into any further detail on the process, I'm able to.
Let me just say for the record that we heard presentations here from representatives of Callan and Makita. I'd point out that both firms are 100% employee-owned. Makita obviously has a relationship with us as our real estate consultant. It turns out that before Aon became our general consultant, that Callan was the general consultant to SDCERS. Both firms are 100% employee-owned. The committee voted to select Callan in a vote of 5-0. So then we're going to move on to the action item on the asset liability study, and for that, we'd ask Aon to make a presentation.
Actually, before we have Aon come, I've been notified that we need a break.
All right.
Can we vote on number one, and then we'll take a 10-minute
So
break?
Rosie, will you put up the motion, please, to vote on number one? Fine. Okay.
So we'll reconvene at
And then with
10:35.
all votes in, Mr. Chair, this motion passes 9-0.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you. No, that's fine.
So I'll turn back to Cliff. Thank you, Cliff, for letting us have a break.
Oh, no, it's absolutely great. All right, so the second action item that we're here to present to the board has to do with the asset liability study. And for that, we have a team of well-scrubbed folks from Aon in Chicago. And maybe, Katie, you'd like to lead us off and introduce your colleagues, please?
Thank you, Cleve. Good morning, everyone. Quick introductions. Thank you for having us today. I'm Katie Comstock with Aon Investments, and to my right, I have Phil Kavarkis. He was here at the last board meeting. He heads up Aon Investments' Investment Policy Services team. This is the group that runs all of our asset liability studies, and he has ran the study for your program several times prior as well. And then to Phil's right is John Sullivan. John works closely with Phil on our investment policy services team and ran your study, so is intimately familiar with both the inputs and the results, and working with the investment team to present this to you today. So as a reminder, here we are today to present the results of this study. We run this every 3 years, and we use the results to infer the appropriate risk posture for the investment assets. We're looking here to mitigate the biggest risk to the investment portfolio of being able to pay benefits in full and on time to the participants. We had a great discussion yesterday with the investment committee going through our presentation. We had a brief discussion on risk. We say that word a lot, but we wanted to define it so that we know what we're talking about. And a framework for how to think about it. And it's really a framework of trade-offs. When we think about the risk. And so the risk we're talking about today is primarily illiquidity risk, making sure those assets are not tied up where we have exposure to private markets, especially in really dire economic times when you need to access those risks, and volatility of expected returns. That's primarily where we'll spend our time, or the dispersion of expected returns and how that impacts projections on things like expected funded ratio, cost to the plan, and overall economic cost for SDCERS public pension plan. If we could flip ahead, just a very quick reminder. At the last meeting, we did the education, talked about our capital market assumptions, which are forward-looking long-term return and risk expectations. Again, today we're here to present the results and ultimately to confirm the level of risk that the portfolio has today. And we'll talk about what that looks like in terms of forward-looking projections and the financial health and how that relates to the goals and objectives of SDCERS. We will be back in July to look at a deeper review of each asset allocation. Do we have the right asset classes at the right percentages? And then post that comes the documentation of formalizing this in your investment policy statement to the extent updates are needed, and looking at the structure, which we do on an annual basis. So we did have a great discussion. Phil and team are going to hit just the highlights and the results, but please, as there are questions, interrupt, and we'll go where necessary. The last thing I did want to mention is that we ran 3 studies, one for the city plan, one for the unified port, and one for the airport. There is a supplemental deck that has the analytics for the airport and the unified port plans. The analytics in this deck are primarily for the city plan, and they all have the same asset allocation. We study that every go-around to make sure that it still makes sense, that there's a single risk posture and a single asset allocation that makes sense for each of those plans, and today it does. But we will talk about there may be a time in the future where the characteristics of the liability and the expected returns may warrant relooking at that position. So with that, if there are no questions or comments, I'll turn it over to Phil and team to cover the results.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Katie. Hello, everyone. So we're going to walk through just the highlights of the 2025 asset liability study. I'm going to start with just a current state of the 3 plans, the city plan, the port district, and the airport authority. Some summary statistics on this page which really illustrate our starting point for each of these plans. Now, we ran 3 individual studies. We're going to focus the bulk of our attention today on the city plan, and you can see some of the summary statistics of the city plan. $10.95 billion of assets as of December 31, 2024. Liability is $14.0 billion, 78.2% funded. in the city plan. Now you can see those city plan liabilities are growing to the tune of about 8.75% per year. But because the plan is underfunded, the assets have to work even harder to keep pace with those liabilities and their growth rate. 11.18% asset growth rate needed to keep pace with the liabilities. The good news is we believe your assets are expected to grow at 13.55%. Now that's a combination of investment performance plus funding into the plan. 13.55%, which represents a 2.37% hurdle rate cushion. And just as a rough estimate, then you can imagine that if your funding ratio is 78%, that means you're 22% short. That means if you have a hurdle rate cushion of a little over 2%, you have an approximate 10-year time frame to hitting full funding. Now, these are rough estimates, and we'll walk through some more specific numbers in our projection analysis. Similarly, for the Port District, similar funding ratio, 80.9%. You can see that there's a 1.87% hurdle rate cushion there, again suggesting an approximately 10-year time frame to get to full funding for the Port District. And then finally, with the Airport Authority, 94.2% funded. And you can see the hurdle rate cushion there is just about 1%, 0.99% to be exact. And so approximately a 5-year time frame to get to a full funding. And just to reiterate, these are rough estimates based on today's numbers. We're going to walk through more specific numbers in our actual asset liability projection analysis. Now, just to say at the Airport Authority, a little bit different situation versus the other two, and as such might lead to different strategies down the line. But here today, we're underfunded in each of the 3 plans, but pointing in the right direction in all 3 of the plans. All right, these summaries I've highlighted largely on the previous page. The one thing I'll note is we studied a wide range of portfolios for further analysis, and we tended to focus on the 60 to 80% return-seeking range. So we'll show you the entire spectrum of analysis, but we'll also focus on the 60 to 80% portfolio solutions. All right, so with that, I'm going to dive into some of the detail. Page 16 is you'll recognize many of these numbers. The numbers that I cited earlier came from this page. All right, portfolio analysis. So you can see here, we analyzed a wide variety of portfolio solutions, and here you can see there's a graph on the top half of the page, expected return versus volatility. You can see that we've studied portfolios 50% return seeking through 100% return seeking. You see your current policy is 78% return seeking. The dotted line represents the actuarial interest rate assumption of 6.5%, and you can see how the expected returns for each of these portfolios compare to that actuarial interest rate assumption. The next page shows the range of returns for each of these portfolio solutions. Now, we mentioned 7.45% is the expected return based on our capital market assumptions for the current policy. And you can see the diamond in the middle of the distribution for the current policy. And these are cumulative returns over a 30-year period. But of course, you can have a scenario that's not as expected. In fact, we modeled quite a wide range of potential scenarios. 5,000 economic scenarios built into our analysis. And they include the best of times, the worst of times, and everything in between. And you can see the range of outcomes, a range of returns for the current policy of between 4.27% and 10.72%. And that represents cases from the very pessimistic to the very optimistic over a 30-year time horizon. You can also see what happens in shorter time horizons. You can see the 2-year range of returns. And it's quite a wide distribution of outcomes. You can see the 7.45% for the current policy, but you can also see that the worst case scenarios go into the negatives, negative 4.33% over a 2-year period, for example, and the best case scenario over 20%. So there's quite a wide range of outcomes, and you can see how that compares as you span across the risk spectrum from 50% to 90%. The central expectation moves, as you move from left to right, the central expectation is increasing, higher return, but also higher risk. And so that's what we've evaluated within the context of the pension plan. All right, so now taking that portfolio analysis and translating that to our stochastic projection analysis, this is an illustration of what stochastic projections look like. And here we don't just run a single simulation. we run 5,000 economic scenarios, and there's going to be very optimistic, very pessimistic cases, and the expected cases built in, and everything in between. And so you can see there's a range of outcomes which we've summarized in terms of percentiles. The black dotted line represents a central expectation. And so you'll see that play out in our projection analysis. And of course, you can see that the top line in this case is a projection of funding ratio. The top line is the most optimistic case, or the 95th percentile. The purple line is the bottom, the worst case. That is the 5th percentile outcome of the projection. So we're trying to capture not just the central expectation, but what happens in the optimistic and pessimistic cases. All right, with that, let's move to the funding ratios. And here you can see, again, we've studied the full range of return seeking, 20% return seeking to 100% return seeking. And you can see that each of these pictures looks quite different. If you were to focus on the 20% return seeking portfolio, you'll notice that dotted line never hits 100%. So it's a very safe portfolio. It has a very small distribution of outcomes, but it never quite hits 100% in our 20-year projection analysis. On the other end of the spectrum, the 100% return seeking portfolio, you'll notice has a trajectory for your funding ratio expected to be quite a bit higher, quite a bit steeper. 2033 is the year it's expected to hit 100% funded, and ultimately progresses to 132% in the expected case over the 20-year period, with a wide range of outcomes. Now you'll notice we mentioned about the 10-year time frame. The 60 to 80% return-seeking solutions bracket that 10-year time frame thereabouts, and you can see 2034 is when we would expect to hit 100% funding. With the 80% return-seeking portfolio, 2036 is when we would expect to hit it with the 60% return-seeking portfolio. The next page, we analyze the contributions, and here you can see the central expectation. I'm going to focus on the 80% return-seeking portfolio, for example. The central expectation for contributions is largely moves sideways over the next 10 or 15 years, probably closer to 10 years, before it starts to trail off. And it trails off as the plan approaches full funding. Once it hits full funding, there's less need for amortizing, paying down the shortfall, and the plan reverts to a more normal cost. And so you can see what happens over time. 10 years from now, we would expect that funding ratio would hit 100% and the contributions would decline over time. And that's to be expected. And of course, we don't necessarily know what's going to happen. You could have cases that are optimistic or pessimistic, and we could have numbers that are quite a bit higher or lower than that. So you can see as you move from left to right how the trajectory of contributions is declining. So you'll notice the 20% return-seeking portfolio has a trajectory of contributions that trends higher than the contributions at the right side of the page. And that's by design. You have an expected return that should subsidize some of those long-term costs on the right side of the page. All right. Net outflows, we studied it. Your plan's paying net about 2% of your fund is outflowing. What does that mean? It means that the contributions, or the benefit payments less the contributions, divided by the funding, divided by the assets. So you're paying out about 2% of your fund every year. That tells us you have quite a bit of time horizon, effectively on average a 50-year lifetime for your assets, long-lived assets. Well short of the 10% where we start getting pretty nervous about the liquidity of the fund, and so we see a pretty healthy liquidity profile. All right, we did a deep dive. I mentioned the 60 to 80%. The one thing I'll mention about this kind of focused look at 60 to 80% range is, we observed that, if you were to look at the 80% return-seeking portfolio, compare that to the 70% return-seeking portfolio, you'll notice by taking 10% of the return-seeking portfolio off, it takes an extra year to get to full funding. Right? So taking 10% of your return-seeking portfolio off will control risk a little bit, but it'll delay achievement of full funding in the expected case by 1 year. And you'll notice the same trend by moving from 70 to 60. Right? So every 10% return-seeking you take off, that will delay the hitting of full funding by about 1 year. 2034 for the 80%, 2035 for the 70%, 2036 for the 60%. And of course, associated with that would come the drop-off in the funding associated with the plan. All right. One more thing that I wanted to cover, and just to check the box, we did a deep dive look at your liquidity profile and stress tested the liquidity profile of the fund. Even in the most stressed environment, we found plenty of liquidity, quite sufficient liquidity in the fund, even in the most pessimistic of cases that we stress tested.
Can you give us some examples of what is the most stressed scenario, just to make it tangible for
Absolutely.
people, please?
Absolutely. So this dark skies analysis is intended to be a tail event. So think of it, in terms of 95th percentile, maybe even a little bit worse. And what does that look like? Imagine 3 years of market decline with little to no recovery thereafter. And when I say 3 years of market decline, imagine that the market gets cut in half, and with little to no recovery thereafter.
So that's not just dark skies, that's kind of like nuclear dark.
It would be a very, very bad scenario.
Okay, fine. So
Yes.
that's a real stress test indeed.
It is. And even in that case,
If you go to page.
oh, okay, sure, yeah. So,
Put in perspective, here this shows the dark skies is even well below that range of potential outcomes. So that would be an accurate depiction, but it is intended to be a very true stress test. And your liquidity profile we expect to be just fine in that situation.
So just historically, had there been like 3 negative years in a row?
If I could jump in,
And no recovery, I'm just curious.
we did a analysis back in 2018 when the city had closed the plan, and we were looking what decisions can we make today to make sure that we have success in the future. And we were looking at various economic models. And one of them was, I said, well, what happened to Japan, where their economy hit rock bottom and they just stayed flat forever? And that was kind of the genesis of this dark skies, is that actually happened. And what if it happened here?
you'd have to go back to, in the U.S., I agree with the Japan comparison, but you'd have to go back to probably the Depression to have a situation like the Depression. I think was even worse than that, but you'd have to go back that far to get to a case.
Okay.
All right. So I think with that, I think the bottom line on top is now the bottom line on bottom. The risk posture, 78% return seeking. Again, the different plans had different times to achievement of full funding, but for the city plan, about 10 years or thereabouts. We did a close look at the 60 to 80% portfolio range, 60 to 80% return seeking, and found that they all made sense, but there were trade-offs. And effectively, for purposes of the plan, from the context of the plan, the trade-off was every 10% you take off of your return-seeking portfolio means an expected additional year before attainment of full funding. We looked at the liquidity as we've just described and found plenty of liquidity even in the most stressed of environments. And that at this point, I think we would pause to examine the strategy, and then next step would be to take a deeper dive into the portfolio structure. Really look at how that portfolio is built. Cliff, you mentioned yesterday, not all 78% return-seeking portfolios are built the same, and so we'd want to take a deeper dive in that respect as well.
Before we move on, for the benefit of, say, newer people on the board and anyone who may be listening to this, could you summarize why we are focusing or talking so much about being 100% funded? What does it mean if you're a plan member or a plan sponsor, in summary?
Absolutely. So,
and if you will, why we think it's very important?
Absolutely. So if your plan is under 100% funded, your contribution requirements are effectively two main components. The normal cost, which is the cost of annual benefits which are earned by your people every year. Your people have one more year of service, their pension benefit grows, and there's a cost associated with the normal accruals for your population. But if you're underfunded, you also have to pay for an amortization of your shortfall. And so the amortization of the shortfall it can be substantial. And so the sum of those two elements represents the annual contribution that goes into your pension plan. Now, when the plan becomes fully funded, that shortfall amortization goes away, and it becomes simply the normal cost. And so there is a significant cost reduction, as we saw in some of our contribution modeling, associated with hitting 100% funded. So it is nice to have.
And I guess the consensus of this board and previous boards is it's desirable as well, because this is part of an ongoing commitment we've had that presumably we're going to continue. It also makes for plan members a sense that the plan is even more safe and more secure. You've highlighted the liquidity stress test, which was very, very reassuring to see under these different downside scenarios, because we can all be optimistic and that's great, but you also have to have, the reality of a rainy day.
And can you also share that the 10-year mark to get full funding is actually above average? That's what we talked about.
That is shorter than average. I don't have any specific data, but just based on my experience, that is shorter than average.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're the 60 to 80% return seeking and then receiving full funding is a good spot for this agency.
Certainly.
Good.
Chris?
So one of the great bits of news in this that I mean, reading through and listening to your presentation yesterday and today, is that you have us at full funding in 2034. That's really great news. So thank you for coming with that. Our actuary at our last presentation had us at full funding in 2042. Could you comment on why your projections might not be in alignment?
Certainly. Yeah. The main difference between that projection and this is his projection assumed 6.5% asset returns, and our projection was 7.45% based on our capital market assumptions. And so that's, I imagine that's the main difference between the two sets of projections.
Yeah, and that's great and perfect. So, so we are making an assumption of, as a board, of returns of 6.5%, which is what's reflected in our discount rate based on what the actuary suggests. And would it be fair to say that that is, at this point in time, more conservative than you think is necessary?
Well, I think it's, the question of the assumption, the lower the assumption, the more conservative. That's true. Appropriateness of the assumption, I think, it's important for this group to discuss that with the actuary and make sure that the actuarial assumptions are appropriate. But I wouldn't say it's inappropriate.
Yeah, in an ideal world, our GIC's projections and our actuaries' projections would be in alignment, right?
Not necessarily.
I think not necessary, and I think we're not here today to discuss the actuary, Chris. You might want to discuss questions for the actuary when they're present, because they're not here to make any comments.
Sure, and I'll be happy to ask the actuary when they're here. Yeah, of course, but I just think it is important to just look at 2042 versus 2034 is a big difference. And
Agree. I think the challenge for, pardon me, for all of us here is the hardest working people will still come up with estimates. And we don't know what will unfold. And that's why we have these ranges of outcomes. And we cannot assure anybody that it will be 2034 on July 15th or 2036 or anything. But these are sort of the goals that we're, sort of the guideposts that we're focused on to help us make decisions in the medium term.
Yeah, and thank you. And look, Mr. Kowarski makes a point that his projections will be wrong, and I'm sure these guys would probably say the same thing. I mean, they're projections. I just wanted to highlight that we've got two different things out there. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I think I feel comfortable with the deviation between the two because they're two different two different work perspectives.
I mean, the actuary, for example, doesn't talk to hundreds of money managers
Right.
and track their performance in dozens of different asset classes and have economists on staff to help them come up with projections over 30 years, God bless you all, of what different asset classes are likely to return. That's not what an actuary does.
Right.
So we shouldn't expect the same thing from them, I guess. But I think we should put a pin in this and revisit this when they're here next time.
Absolutely.
Any other questions or comments?
One comment on that question, if we go to page 30. So if I focus on the 75% return-seeking portfolio at this point, that shows hitting full funding by 2034. That's based off of our median capital market assumptions, which was at basically 7.45. Because the actuary is projecting something lower than that, we can then infer that the actuary's projections would be in the area lower than that dashed line, but above the line right below it, kind of in that zone, which is where that 2042 would also fall. So I just wanted to call that out as a way to tie the two together.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm pleased to report. What? Sure. The chair has reminded me to try to bring to front of mind how important this step is in the larger process that we do on a regular basis of establishing kind of a risk target. And then based on that, we will, as the calendar has shown us, have a more fulsome discussion of how the portfolio is to be constructed and then ultimately how it's actually implemented. I see nods from the investment staff, so I feel good that I'm going in the right direction on that, too.
Thank you for that.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
I'm pleased to report that this item was approved of a 78%, 22% risk budget allocation by a vote of 5-0 at the investment committee yesterday. Do we need to vote on this as well?
Yes,
All right,
Mr.
then,
Chair.
Rosie.
It was moved by you, Mr. Chair, Clifford Cheerson, and with all votes in, Mr. Chair, this motion passes 9-0.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now we go back to, if you will, your earlier question, comment, Ms. Bush.
Maybe introduce the item.
Well, I was going to,
Okay, go ahead.
okay. We, you want to do this?
No, go ahead.
My hands are cold, I'm sorry about that. There is a question about the action item on the extension of Aon's contract as general consultant. And Michelle, do you want to make some comments? You asked it to be pulled from the...
Only that Greg mentioned the favorable terms and the great job that staff did in negotiating the extension years. And so my question is, I guess, why wouldn't we take advantage of that if we have a contract that allows for 2 extension terms? So just moving out that RFP process, instead of the RFP process being going on during the first extension year, that we move it to the second extension year and take advantage of that, the favorable terms that we have today.
That's a great question for our Chief Investment Officer. Creighton, you want to field that question?
Can't hear you, it's not on yet.
Testing. There we go. So the Aon contract was entered in 2020, and as previously noted, it was a 5-year term, and it had these 2-year pre-negotiated embedded extensions. And I believe that's the first time that the Aon contract foresaw extensions. So we originally contract with Aon back in 2010, again in 2015, and again in 2020. And each time we had done full RFPs because it is a high dollar value contract. So it was to ensure competitive pricing. Now the RFP itself is quite lengthy, and we want to ensure we have sufficient staff time to conduct a full RFP, and that could take up to a year. So the question would be if we could do 1 year extension now, and that would put us into sort of year 6, if you will. And that was the request, since the policy says a max of 5 years per contract, to get that additional year approved, and that would be a board decision now. And then the question is, what about that second year? Should you just do that now? If I'm understanding your question correctly, you want to approve both 1 year extensions presently, with the understanding that staff would begin a full RFP beginning at the beginning of the 7th year. Do I understand that correctly? I think that's an option for the board to consider. The other side of it is, since it is a high dollar value contract, and to ensure you have competitive pricing, you could do perhaps at 1 year out, a check that's not a full-blown RFP, but just a competitive pricing bid with several vendors. That might be another option.
Mm-hmm. And we'd have the fallback into the second year.
Yes, you would.
Right. Yeah, I was just considering what would motivate us to not take advantage of pricing that we know today, that we know is favorable to the plan, and if we have that option to do that, to go ahead and take advantage of that, especially after getting just past Prop B and all the other challenges that we've had. I would love like a little bit of a breather.
Yeah.
Before we take on such a critical RFP. So
one other thing to consider is scope can also change slightly. And that's just something, I'm not saying that their scope has materially changed, but it is something to review more regularly to ensure that, for example, we're not overpaying for expanded scope than what was previously.
And I'm sure you all are diligently looking at the scope of what we're...
Certainly when we contract.
Okay.
And if I may, it just occurs to me, and you're bringing this up this morning, Michelle, and thank you for it, is that we may well learn something about the scope for the general consultant as we begin working with our private markets consultant in conjunction with our real estate consultant.
Yes.
That would give staff more wisdom of
Yes.
what would be beneficial in the scope of responsibilities for the general consultant. So again, a little bit of breathing room.
Right. Mm-hmm. So is there a motion?
So Michelle, do you want to make a motion?
Yeah, my motion is there is a sentence in the recommendation. It says,
Here, this is the motion. Oh, this is the language there.
okay. So staff shall approach the board with regard to executing.
Instead of a 1 year extension.
2 year extension.
Yeah.
Yes, 2 1 year.
Or do we just want to do 2 years?
I think when you
They can't go
execute
past 2.
the option year, you have to complete.
And I just want to chime in before we start voting, just because I don't want to vote no without explaining why. I like Aon. I think they're doing a great job for us. But my understanding is that's the biggest contract we have. And there's a reason we look at it every 5 years, and it's to keep everybody honest, make sure our pricing is right, make sure the scope is right. And I think arbitrarily extending it for breathing room, to me, we're not upholding our fiduciary responsibilities. If there's a specific reason, as Cliff mentioned, another company giving us additional insight, in the interim.
If I may,
Go
what I
ahead.
heard Michelle say at the very beginning is the economic terms in the existing contract are very favorable.
I hear that, but isn't that looking backwards? We don't know what favorable is because we haven't looked at the market in 5 years.
If I may.
Please.
In 2020, SDCERS worked with a firm called Cortex. Now, as I understand, that firm is, I believe, no longer doing this service. But the board hired a consultant to run the RFP for the general investment consultant. And that was with the idea to have a truly unbiased recommendation coming to the board, as the consultant does report directly to the board. So that was the process anyways that was carried out in 2020. And yeah, it is a high dollar value contract, and it is something that the board could consider again for the general investment consultant.
Your suggestion that we go out, I don't know if it's an RFI, that's the term, where a request for information to see if the pricing is still competitive is an option that might satisfy.
Yes.
Okay. That question about whether or not we're still in a competitive advantage from a pricing perspective.
Yes, and I think it personally would be good practice to hire a consultant for this purpose to retain that independence.
So, Michelle, do you have a motion here now?
The motions, what I said earlier stands, and also include hiring a consultant to look at pricing, going through the process of checking on pricing to make sure that we still are in a competitive situation.
Can I just ask you a quick? Most contracts have termination for convenience. I would imagine this contract has it as well. So if you find that your new RFP has better pricing, you could probably stop the current contract and start with
Yes.
a new contract.
And I believe, and I have folks from Aon to keep me honest, I think it's a 30-day written termination clause. Yes.
If we are going to add, it's okay. Sorry, I'm just, now that it sounded like we were going to add now a consultant to then do an advice, and so I'm kind of wondering about the fiscal impact of that as well. It sounds like it was kind of a standard practice for us 5 years ago, so that makes sense to me, but.
Well, I would just also add the level of complexity of this work. I hope we're not just going to compare pricing, because if a consultant comes in at a lesser price, especially listening to this conversation, they could win the bid, even though they're not the most competent. So we got to there's a number of factors that have to be considered when reviewing this level of work.
Would there be value, Michelle, based on some of this discussion, in approving the 1 year and asking staff to come back with a recommendation on the 2-year thing? And then they can come back with the rationale behind should we do this or not, and we could have a discussion about it.
I mean, either way, we're going to do an RFP at the end of the second year.
Yes.
I have a question. Karina, in the recent past, I believe you had a consultant do a fee study,
Yeah.
correct?
Yes, Curcio Web.
And how did that turn out?
At that time, and I believe it was 2023, the study indicated that the fees paid are a bit higher, but that is, again, comparing to a universe of plans, and we have to also consider the complexity of our plans, as well as there has been some consolidation within the consulting industry, and fees have been under pressure.
I'd like to point out that I objected to some of the results from Curcio Web because the sample they used was not predominantly public plans. It included corporate plans predominantly. So there's an asterisk on this.
Yeah, I remember that.
And maybe we could do another fee study around public plans. Leave it to staff, I think.
I think that would be an excellent area for a consultant to study. Consultant that's versed in that space.
Okay, Ms. Bush, where are you on this?
What Chris said.
So so the motion as proposed for a 1-year extension.
And then staff will come back with recommendation on the second year before we decide whether or not we're going to go out for an RFP.
So I apologize, our voting system is down, so we'll have to do this manually with just a vocal vote. But what would, kind of just procedurally, we'll be voting on the recommendation as presented for staff's recommendation to recommend a 1-year contract extension. And then there's direction to staff to that when we are approaching to put out an RFP, that we come back and talk to the investment committee with regards to process and how we're going to conduct the RFP and what resources we'd need and what is the project timeline.
And then also the staff will come back for the fifth year.
That'll be part of coming back with regards to going out to proposal.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect.
And I would be happy to take everyone's verbal cues so I can enter it into the system. So if, just for the record, to state it, you would be taking a vote on motion to approve a 1-year extension of Aon's general investment consulting contract. And if I could please have a mover.
I'll move.
Thank you, Mr. Shearson.
Don't need a second.
Don't need a second. And then I will do a roll call for the votes. Ms. Lisa Marie Harris,
Yes.
Mr. Krista Brewster,
Yes.
Ms. Michelle Bush,
Yes.
Ms. Christiana Gauga,
Yes.
Mr. Paul Lotz,
Yes.
Mr. Louis Maggi,
Yes.
Mr. Kent Morris,
Yes.
Mr. Clifford Cheerson,
Yes.
and Ms. Roberta Spoon.
Yes.
And with all votes in, this motion passes 9-0, and the same would go moving forward. If there's anything that needs to be expressed to the public, I'm happy to repeat it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I assume we can continue with our information item?
Yes.
Okay. So we want to talk about an update on the proxy voting vendor search as was reported to the committee.
So real short and sweet. We were previously serviced by Glass Lewis, and that contract runs through the end of the year. It was at quite a bit higher price point. So on the order of about $50,000, Demetrius, keep me honest here, moving now to a new provider at $10,000. So that's quite a bit of fee savings. It's in reflection also of the fact that we're using more commingled investment trusts, and there are fewer proxies to vote. I don't know Demetrius, if you want to add any other color, if there are any other questions on this item itself.
If I can just share with my colleagues, having worked a little bit in this space, it's kind of Coke and Pepsi. You either have one or the other. There's really not a lot of other choices here. And so every now and again, we have to just have a quick look and double check, right? Did I miss anything there, Demetrius? Is there a new upstart I'm not aware of in this space?
Dr. Pepper in the mix?
And
No
in all
RC
fairness,
or anything.
the incumbent also reduced the bid quite significantly, but it was still a little bit higher than ISS.
Okay.
And wrapping things up, there are a number of reports, but there's nothing to report out to the board from the session and on that front end. We're done.
Okay. Thank you, Cliff, for the committee report. We are going to move to Section 9, question and comments. Do we have any questions, comments, or education session reports from the board members? Go ahead, Chris.
I want to thank the board for some really extraordinary things that happened at this meeting from my perspective. And there are some things that we've talked about for a while, but they're very, very important to members. One of them is we had a case not too long ago of a case that went to adjudication. And there was some concern about the cost to the member in terms of being part of the adjudication. And we approved at this meeting a different approach to adjudication, which I think will probably lessen the number of these cases and ensure that we as a board are on board with the need to go to adjudication, which will likely save SDCERS money, but also hopefully the members' money. And I would like to thank Greg in particular for being part of that, but also staff looking at that and agreeing to a different process, because I think it will be very, very important going forward to our members. The second thing is a little bit more personal. I had an opportunity to have lunch with a former lifeguard and former fire captain who I worked with last fall at the Retired Fire and Police Association, who has had cancer of his jaw, and about half of his jaw is missing. He's a great guy. And as I was sitting across the table from him and we were discussing old lifeguard stuff and whatever, he was holding a wad of napkins because it was very difficult for him to eat. And I asked him whether he was able to retire, get the benefits of disability retirement. And he told me that he had tried to do that, but was told that because he was in drop, he could not qualify. And it was a very difficult conversation. You agreed at this meeting to change that. And I just wanted to thank you very much. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Director Brewster, and I appreciate your comments. And thank you for this board for us taking that time and effort to change the drop program so that hopefully we can eliminate that kind of situation going forward. And thank you to the staff as well for supporting the board in that action. So, Greg, do you have any comments for us?
Yes. To begin my comments, I really wanted to welcome Kent Morris to the SDCERS board. And as we've previously mentioned, we're really fortunate to have you with your executive management experience and your investment experience. So thank you. Welcome. I'd also like to thank Bobby Spoon for her service on the audit committee. Bobby served on the audit committee for 8 years, and as I had mentioned at our business and governance committee, when I joined the organization, the audit committee was up to its elbows in operational tasks. I came my first meeting, the committee was rewriting financial statement footnotes. And Bobby, and with the help also of Paul Kaufman, who's not here today, kind of changed the governance structure of that committee and really brought it to an oversight at a policy level. So thank you so much for that. And the reason I'm thanking you is that you're stepping off the audit committee and to make room for kind of the next generation of audit committee members. So we have Shira Cohen joining the committee. So your leadership has just been exemplary, and so thank you. I just really appreciate your service. And I would also like to thank Bobby, Cliff, and Paul for being our committee chairs. This is a volunteer board, and to shoulder that additional responsibility is not neutral. That takes more time, effort, energy, and time from the other things that you have a very busy life doing. So we don't take that for granted. So thank you very much for being our chairs. And last but certainly not least, Cliff, thank you for stepping up and being our vice president. So thank you. Really appreciate you, and I look forward to working with you in that capacity in the coming year. On a different task, on a monthly basis, we conduct email phishing with staff to test their cybersecurity skills and reinforce good cybersecurity practices. In March, staff scored 100%. Nobody clicked on anything. We were pretty happy, pretty glad about that. April, we did have one failure. We tricked one person. But we also have quarterly board phishing. As a report, we reported our January results last time around. And for the April 2025 test of 14 board recipients, 4 opened the mail and deleted it, with one board member being tricked into taking the bait and clicking on an embedded link. And I would say the lessons learned from this were actually really great. The reason I bring this up is that sometimes when we use our smartphones, it's really hard to see what are we really clicking on. And that's really what happened in this case. I feel that had it been on a big screen, I don't think we would have had that. But when we use our smartphones, sometimes it's easier to be tricked. So that was kind of the lessons learned. So like the city of San Diego's motto, Semper Vigilans, we must always be vigilant. You may recall the IRS sent notices of a data breach in December 2024 by a contractor that may or may not have released SDCERS member data. In response, SDCERS notified all of our members and implemented a hotline for members with questions. And after fielding a total of 3 calls, the last one being in February, we have officially closed that hotline as of mid-April. So better safe than sorry, but I'm glad that it did not turn out to be a big thing. I wanted to thank Karina Coleman for being actively involved in our pension community. She served on a panel on investment program governance for the Next Generation's conference put on by With Intelligence. So thank you, Karina. Recently, I was invited by the Orange County Employees Retirement System to be a panelist on their search for a chief technology officer, someone to oversee both of their information, their the chief information officer and their chief technology officer. And what was really fun about that recruitment, this was round 3, they had 3 finalists. And many times when you're looking at that level, it's 3 versions of the same person. There are like 3 candidates, but slightly different. But this recruitment, there were 3 very, very different management styles and they all were technology great, but they're all 3 different management styles. So it was a lot of fun to help OSERS find who would be a good fit with their culture and their values. So it was just kind of a fun presentation, and they were very grateful of the time we dedicated to help them out. And lastly, yesterday, SDCERS Finance Director Ted LaSalvia, hi Ted, and myself attended the City of San Diego Council's budget hearings to present an information item on the SDCERS budget. We provided a 10-minute SDCERS 101 overview, which included SDCERS independence, the city's funded status, SDCERS operating as a profit center by funding the majority of the city's pension plans benefit payments from portfolio earnings, the investment portfolio's long-term diversified structure designed to anticipate rising and falling market cycles, and the board's stable and predictable cost funding objective working very well by keeping the ADC within a band of about 21 to 22% of the city's general fund labor costs. We also provided a 5-minute overview of the SDCERS budget. We received a couple of pointed questions from one council member regarding the need to contribute so much money to SDCERS when the city has a good funded status, and SDCERS consideration of the mayor's request to mayoral departments to reduce their budgets. And that finishes up my comments. Thank you.
Okay. Any comments or questions for Greg?
What was the answer to them on that question?
If I may, who was asking those
Right.
questions also, please?
Well, I'll follow up with you after the meeting on which council member that was. But the question with regards to the good funding was a very valid question at these times, because they're looking for more budget relief. At our February retreat, I put up those little speed dials that showed where you are. Are you below, like in low funding? Are you in good funding or best funding? And the city's hanging on right about at the brink between low funding and good funding. And so what I mentioned was that the actuary has projected that the plan should be receive full funding in 17 years in 2042.
2034.
And that is the average working life, or the average working period of the current city workforce. So they're going to be paying that over the time that the current employees who are in the plan before they retire. That's a good benchmark. And I said, with regards to the amount of money, because she did mention oh, now I let it slip. She mentioned that
Still 50/50.
Yeah.
about the city chief financial officer coming in here a year ago, January, requesting to re-amortize the debt. And, why couldn't we have done that? And I mentioned that starting in 1995 through about 2005, the city created a severe funding crisis by delaying planned funding, and that we would not like to relive that and have that happen again and create even a further elevated payment in another pension funding crisis.
Right. Well, thank you for handling that.
Certainly.
Any other questions for Greg? Okay. So we're moving to Section 10, closed session. Johnny, do we have any closed session items today?
Yes, we do, Lisa Marie. I need about 15 minutes to discuss the Robert Acosta matter and the 4 existing litigation matters against us.
Okay, so the board will be going into closed session for staff, consultants, and visitors not invited in the closed session. Please leave the room. Rosie, please stop recording the meeting while we're in closed session. Thank you.
Is the food here? Sure. But I like the multi-page approach, because we do put out various community property process.
Tasha has this email thing set up, so there's regular emails going out to the members. You can just throw this out there every once in a while as a reminder.
Well, there you go. We could, with artificial intelligence, we could, start putting out people
You can
that.
scrub data to see who's filed for a dissolution of marriage. in
Exactly.
courts, and then tie that back. Never mind. Okay, fine. I'm crazy.
So Rosie, please begin recording the meeting and let me know when you're ready to begin open session.
We're ready, Madam
We're ready?
President.
Okay. Okay, well, we have finished closed session and have returned to open session agenda item. We are beginning with Section 11, closed session report. Johnny, can you please give us a report?
Yes, thank you. The board voted to file an amicus brief in the LaSarra versus LA County action in front of the California Supreme Court and entered a settlement concerning the death benefits of Robert Acosta. Thank you.
That concludes your report?
It does.
Okay, are there any other closing comments or questions? Okay, with that, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Mhm.